The water was everywhere. Brown, churning, unstoppable water that swallowed everything in its path. I stood on my porch, watching 20 years of my neighbors' lives disappear beneath the flood that I knew was coming. The same neighbors who celebrated when they forced me to destroy my dam just 6 months earlier. My hands gripped the porch railing as I watched the HOA president's white Mercedes float past my driveway like a bathtub toy. The irony was not lost on me. The woman who called my dam an eyesore was now watching her dream home fill with muddy water through windows that would never close properly again. But this story does not start with the flood. It starts with a knock on my door and a woman with a clipboard who thought she could tell me what to do on my own land. What happened next would teach an entire neighborhood that sometimes Mother Nature has the final say in human disputes. My name is David, and I have lived on 40 acres of rolling hills in what used to be the middle of nowhere for 23 years. When I bought this land, there were no neighbors for miles. Just me, my workshop, and the seasonal creek that ran through the back corner of my property. The creek was peaceful most of the year, barely a trickle during summer months. But when the rains came, it transformed into something completely different. I learned this the hard way during my second spring here, when 3 days of heavy rain turned that gentle creek into a raging torrent that carved a new path straight through my vegetable garden and threatened the foundation of my barn. That was when I decided to build the dam. Nothing fancy or elaborate, just a simple earthen retention structure with proper spillways and drainage channels. I researched the design carefully, consulted with a local engineer, and even got the necessary permits from the county. The dam was built to capture and slowly release the seasonal runoff, preventing the destructive flooding that had become a regular problem. For 15 years, my dam worked perfectly. During heavy rains, it would fill with water and then gradually release it through the spillways in a controlled manner. The seasonal flooding stopped completely. My property stayed dry, and more importantly, so did the low-lying areas downstream where housing developments eventually started appearing. Those housing developments changed everything. What started as a few scattered homes grew into a full subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates. The developers marketed it as a peaceful rural community with the charm of country living. They built beautiful homes with perfect lawns and decorative mailboxes. The new residents loved the quiet atmosphere and the fact that they never had to worry about flooding, though most of them had no idea why. I got along well with my new neighbors at first. They were mostly young families and retirees who appreciated the country lifestyle. Some of them would wave when they drove past my property. A few even stopped by to introduce themselves and compliment my well-maintained land. Everything seemed perfect until the homeowners association formed. The HOA started innocently enough. The residents wanted to maintain property values and ensure the neighborhood stayed attractive. They established rules about lawn care, mailbox styles, and house colors. At first, it did not affect me at all since my property was not part of their development. I watched from a distance as they organized community events and maintained the common areas. But then Jennifer Morrison moved into the neighborhood. Jennifer was a recently divorced real estate agent who seemed to have strong opinions about everything. Within 6 months of moving in, she had been elected HOA president on a platform of enhanced community standards and eliminating neighborhood eyesores. I should have seen the trouble coming when she started parking her car at the edge of my property and taking photos of my dam. At first, I thought she was just curious about the structure. Maybe she was interested in the wildlife that had made the small pond their home, or perhaps she appreciated the engineering involved in building an effective flood control system. I was wrong. Jennifer saw my dam as a problem that needed solving. In her mind, the rustic earthen structure with its natural stone spillways was an ugly disruption to the pristine suburban landscape she was trying to create. The fact that it sat on private property outside her jurisdiction apparently did not matter to her. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early October. I was working in my shop when I heard car doors slamming in my driveway. Through the window, I saw Jennifer Morrison walking toward my front door with two other people I did not recognize. All three of them carried clipboards and wore expressions that suggested this was not going to be a friendly social visit. Jennifer Morrison stood on my front porch like she owned the place. She wore a navy blue blazer and held her clipboard like a weapon. The two people with her introduced themselves as HOA board members, though I had never seen them before in my life. "We need to discuss your damn situation," Jennifer announced without any greeting or pleasantries. Her tone suggested she was already certain of the outcome of this conversation. "What situation would that be?" I asked, genuinely confused about what business my dam was to anyone outside my property lines. "That unsightly structure is affecting property values in our community," she replied, gesturing vaguely toward the back of my land. "Several homeowners have complained about the visual impact on their neighborhood experience." I stared at her for a long moment, trying to process what I was hearing. My dam sat a quarter-mile from the nearest house in the subdivision. You could barely see it from the road, and it was completely invisible from most of the homes in Meadowbrook Estates. More importantly, it was on my private property and had been there for over 15 years. "The dam serves an important flood control function," I explained patiently. "Without it, your entire neighborhood would be at risk during heavy rain seasons. It protects your homes from the seasonal runoff that flows through this area." Jennifer waved her hand dismissively. "We have modern drainage systems in our development. We do not need some amateur flood control project creating an eyesore in our community." "My dam is not in your community," I reminded her. "This is my private property." "Nevertheless, it affects our property values," she insisted. "We have researched the relevant regulations, and we believe there are several violations that need to be addressed." That was when I realized this was not a neighborly discussion about community concerns. This was the opening move in a planned attack on my property rights. Jennifer and her HOA board had come prepared for war, not conversation. Over the following weeks, the assault intensified. I received certified letters almost daily, each one more threatening than the last. The HOA claimed my dam violated environmental regulations, zoning restrictions, and community standards that somehow applied to property outside their jurisdiction. They threatened fines, legal action, and involvement of county officials. I spent hundreds of dollars on legal consultations, trying to understand how an HOA could possibly have authority over my private property. The lawyers I spoke with assured me that HOAs could not regulate property outside their designated areas, but they warned that fighting bureaucratic harassment could become extremely expensive. Meanwhile, Jennifer Morrison was busy building her case through political connections and aggressive lobbying. She attended county planning meetings, filed complaints with environmental agencies, and organized petition drives among Meadowbrook Estates residents. She painted herself as a concerned citizen, fighting to protect the community from a dangerous and unsightly private dam. The breakthrough she needed came when she discovered that the creek running through my property was classified as a seasonal waterway under county jurisdiction. This technical designation gave her the opening she needed to argue that my dam affected public water resources, and therefore required additional permits and inspections. Suddenly, I was dealing with multiple government agencies that had never been interested in my dam before. Environmental regulators wanted soil samples and water quality tests. The county planning department demanded engineering reports and impact studies. Each agency required different permits, inspections, and fees that quickly added up to thousands of dollars. The worst part was watching former allies turn against me under pressure. The same county officials who had approved my original dam permits now questioned whether the structure met current safety standards. Environmental inspectors who had never expressed concerns about my 15-year-old dam suddenly found potential violations that required immediate attention. I tried reasoning with my neighbors, explaining how the dam protected their homes from flooding. Some of them listened politely, but none of them were willing to publicly oppose the HOA. They had invested their life savings in their Meadowbrook Estates homes and were terrified of doing anything that might affect their property values or put them in conflict with Jennifer Morrison. The legal bills mounted as I fought on multiple fronts. Environmental lawyers, zoning attorneys, and permit specialists all charged premium rates for their services. I was spending more money each month on legal fees than most people spend on rent, just to defend my right to maintain a flood control structure that had been protecting the area for 15 years. The final blow came on a rainy Thursday morning in December. I opened my mailbox to find an official letter from the county planning department. After months of pressure from the HOA and their political allies, the county had decided that my dam required immediate modifications to meet current safety standards, or it would have to be removed entirely. The estimated cost for bringing the dam up to the new standards was over $40,000. The cost of removal would be covered by the county, but I would be prohibited from rebuilding any flood control structures without extensive permits that could take years to obtain. Jennifer Morrison had won. She had successfully used the bureaucratic system to force me to destroy the very thing that had been protecting her neighborhood from floods for over a decade. The demolition crew arrived on a cold January morning. 3 men with heavy machinery who treated my dam like just another obstacle to be removed. They had no idea they were about to eliminate the only thing standing between Meadowbrook Estates and a natural disaster. I watched from my kitchen window as the excavator's bucket bit into the earthen wall that had taken me weeks to build by hand. Each scoop of dirt felt like a punch to my stomach. 20 years of careful engineering and flood prevention was being destroyed in a matter of hours because Jennifer Morrison thought it was ugly. The county inspector stood nearby with his clipboard, making sure the job was done according to specifications. He avoided making eye contact with me, probably because he knew this was wrong but lacked the courage to stand up to the political pressure that had forced this decision. "You might want to move those flower beds away from the house," I called out to Mrs. Chen, my nearest neighbor, as she watched the demolition from her backyard. "When the spring rains come, this whole area is going to flood." She gave me a worried look but did not respond. I could see the concern in her eyes, but I also knew she was too afraid of the HOA to acknowledge that my warning might be legitimate. I spent the day taking photographs and videos of the demolition process. Something told me I would need documentation of exactly what was happening and who was responsible for the decision. The county inspector noticed my camera and seemed uncomfortable, but he could not legally stop me from documenting the destruction of my own property. As the day progressed, I tried one more time to explain the situation to anyone who would listen. I approached the demolition crew foreman and showed him the old photographs of spring floods before the dam was built. "This whole area used to flood every year," I explained, pointing to the low-lying ground where most of the Meadowbrook Estates homes now stood. My dam was the only thing preventing that water from reaching those houses. The foreman studied the photographs with interest. "That is a lot of water," he acknowledged. "Where does it go now?" "Straight through the neighborhood," I replied. "They are going to learn the hard way why I built this dam in the first place." Word of my warning spread quickly through the subdivision. Some residents approached me privately to ask about the flood risk, but none of them were willing to publicly challenge the HOA decision. They had too much invested in their homes to risk getting on Jennifer Morrison's bad side. The demolition was completed by late afternoon. Where my carefully engineered dam had stood for 15 years, there was now just a scar in the earth and an unrestricted channel that would funnel the next major rainfall directly toward the subdivision. That evening, I checked the long-range weather forecast on my computer. The meteorologists were predicting a particularly active spring rain season. El Niño conditions in the Pacific were expected to bring heavier than normal precipitation to our region. Some forecasts suggested we could see rainfall totals 50% above average. I printed out the weather reports and filed them with my photographs of the dam removal. If my predictions about flooding proved correct, I wanted to have a complete record of what had happened and who was responsible for the decision to remove the flood control structure. Over the following weeks, I noticed small signs that validated my concerns. The first moderate rainfall in February created standing water in areas that had been dry for 15 years. The natural drainage channels that my dam had controlled were already starting to carve new paths through the landscape. Mrs. Chen mentioned that her basement had gotten damp during the February rain, something that had never happened before. Other neighbors reported similar issues, but the HOA newsletter dismissed these concerns as normal seasonal variations that would resolve themselves as the weather improved. Jennifer Morrison remained defiant about the dam removal. At the March HOA meeting, she praised the success of the community beautification project and announced that property values in Meadowbrook Estates had increased by an average of 3% since the unsightly flood control structure had been eliminated. I did not attend the meeting, but I heard about her comments from Mrs. Chen, who was starting to have serious doubts about the HOA's decision. She mentioned that several other residents were also worried about the approaching spring rain season, but none of them wanted to openly question Jennifer's leadership. As March turned to April, the weather reports became increasingly ominous. Meteorologists were revising their precipitation forecasts upward, predicting the wettest spring in over 20 years. Storm systems were lining up across the Pacific, each one carrying massive amounts of moisture that would eventually reach our area. I began making preparations for what I knew was coming. I moved valuable items from my lower workshop to higher ground and made sure my emergency supplies were well stocked. I also continued documenting everything, taking photographs of the altered landscape and keeping detailed records of weather predictions and rainfall measurements. The last thing I did was write a letter to every homeowner in Meadowbrook Estates, warning them about the flood risk and suggesting they consider purchasing flood insurance if they had not already done so. I hand-delivered the letters to their mailboxes on a Sunday morning, hoping that at least some of them would take the warning seriously. Jennifer Morrison found out about my letters within hours. She sent me a threatening message through her lawyer, demanding that I stop spreading false information designed to create panic in the community. She accused me of trying to sabotage property values out of spite over the dam removal. I ignored her threats. I had done everything I could to warn people about what was coming. Now all I could do was wait for nature to prove me right. The first real test came in mid-April. A modest spring storm dropped 2 inches of rain over the course of 12 hours. Under normal circumstances, it would have been just another pleasant spring shower. But without my dam to control the runoff, those 2 inches became a preview of the disaster that was building. I stood at my kitchen window, coffee mug in hand, watching the water flow through the channel where my dam used to be. Instead of being captured and slowly released through controlled spillways, the runoff rushed straight toward Meadowbrook Estates like a river that had forgotten its banks. By noon, I could see standing water in the subdivision streets. The modern drainage systems that Jennifer Morrison had praised so confidently were completely overwhelmed by the volume of water flowing off my property. Storm drains backed up, and water began pooling in low-lying areas where homes had been built without consideration for natural flood patterns. Mrs. Chen called me around 3 o'clock, panic evident in her voice. "David, there is water coming up through my basement floor. This has never happened before. What should I do?" "Get your important documents and valuables moved to the second floor," I advised. "This is just the beginning. The big storms have not even arrived yet." Over the next few days, I received similar calls from other neighbors. Water in basements, soggy lawns that would not drain, and foundation problems that had never existed before. The April shower had revealed what my dam had been preventing for 15 years, but it was nothing compared to what the weather forecasters were predicting for May. The National Weather Service issued their first flood watch of the season on April 28th. A massive storm system was developing over the Pacific, drawing moisture from tropical regions, and promising to deliver it to our area in unprecedented quantities. Meteorologists were calling it an atmospheric river event that could dump 6 to 8 inches of rain over a 2-day period. I printed out the forecast and added it to my growing file of documentation. Then I walked the perimeter of my property, taking photographs of every area where water would naturally flow toward the subdivision. The evidence was overwhelming. Without the dam, every drop of rain that fell on my 40 acres would end up in Meadowbrook Estates. The HOA held an emergency meeting on May 2nd to discuss the temporary drainage issues that had developed since the April rain. I did not attend, but Mrs. Chen filled me in on the details later that evening. "Jennifer insisted that the problems were not related to your dam," she reported. She blamed the city for inadequate storm drain maintenance and said the standing water was a normal part of spring weather patterns. "What did the other residents say?" I asked. "Most of them seemed convinced by her explanation," Mrs. Chen admitted. "But a few people asked direct questions about whether removing the dam had been a mistake. Jennifer got very defensive and accused them of being influenced by your scare tactics." I shook my head in frustration. Even with water literally flowing into their basements, some people were still more willing to trust Jennifer Morrison's political spin than their own eyes. The second storm system arrived on May 6th, bringing 4 inches of rain in 18 hours. This time, the flooding was impossible to ignore. Water rose so high in some streets that residents could not drive their cars. The subdivision's main entrance was completely submerged, forcing people to wade through knee-deep water to reach their homes. My phone rang constantly as panicked neighbors called for advice. Some wanted to know if the flooding would get worse. Others asked whether they should evacuate their homes. A few brave souls even admitted that they were starting to understand why I had built the dam in the first place. But Jennifer Morrison remained defiant. She organized volunteers to help with sandbagging efforts and insisted that the flooding was a temporary problem that would be resolved once the city upgraded the storm drain system. She even suggested that I was somehow responsible for the flooding because I had not properly restored the natural drainage patterns after the dam removal. The accusation was so absurd that I almost laughed. The natural drainage patterns were exactly what was causing the flooding. My dam had been specifically designed to interrupt those patterns and prevent the seasonal runoff from overwhelming the low-lying areas where the subdivision had been built. As May progressed, the weather forecasts became increasingly alarming. The Pacific storm systems were not weakening as expected. Instead, they were intensifying and moving closer together, creating the potential for what meteorologists called a perfect storm scenario. On May 15th, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning for our entire county. The next storm system was expected to be the largest of the season, potentially dumping 8 to 10 inches of rain over a 3-day period. Emergency management officials recommended that residents in flood-prone areas consider temporary evacuation. I spent that afternoon making final preparations for the disaster I knew was coming. I moved my truck to higher ground, secured everything that could be damaged by wind or water, and made sure my emergency radio was working properly. Then I called Mrs. Chen one more time. "This is going to be the big one," I warned her. "If you have somewhere else you can stay for a few days, now would be a good time to pack a bag." "How bad do you think it will be?" she asked. I looked out my window at the channel where my dam used to be, imagining it filled with the torrential runoff from 10 inches of rain falling over 3 days. The volume of water would be unlike anything the subdivision had ever experienced. "Bad enough that Jennifer Morrison is finally going to understand why I built that dam," I replied. The storm arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning on May 18th. I woke to the sound of rain hammering against my bedroom window with an intensity I had rarely experienced. This was not the gentle spring shower that most people associate with May weather. This was nature preparing to deliver a harsh lesson about the consequences of ignoring flood control. By dawn, 3 inches of rain had already fallen, and the downpour showed no signs of letting up. I made coffee and positioned myself at my kitchen window to watch the disaster unfold. The channel where my dam had been was already running like a river, carrying massive volumes of water directly toward Meadowbrook Estates. At 7 o'clock, I received the first panicked phone call of the day. Mrs. Chen was crying as she described water rising in her basement faster than she could pump it out. Her sump pump was running continuously, but it could not keep up with the volume of water seeping through her foundation. "I should have listened to your warnings," she sobbed. "My basement is ruined. 20 years of stored belongings are floating in muddy water." I felt terrible for her, but there was nothing I could do except offer moral support and practical advice. "Focus on staying safe," I told her. "Material possessions can be replaced. Get yourself and your family to the second floor and wait for the water to recede." By 10 o'clock, the situation in the subdivision had deteriorated dramatically. The storm drains had given up entirely, and water was flowing through the streets like rivers. Cars were stranded in parking lots that had become temporary lakes. Some residents were using kayaks and canoes to navigate their own neighborhood. The irony was not lost on me as I watched Jennifer Morrison's white Mercedes float past my driveway. The same woman who had called my dam an eyesore was now learning the hard way why flood control structures exist. Her dream home, with its perfect lawn and decorative mailbox, was taking on water like a sinking ship. Around noon, the local emergency management agency issued a mandatory evacuation order for the entire Meadowbrook Estates subdivision. Fire department rescue boats were dispatched to help residents who could not safely leave their homes on foot. The subdivision that had been marketed as a peaceful rural community was now an official disaster zone. I spent the afternoon documenting everything with my camera. The photographs would serve as evidence in the legal proceedings that were sure to follow, but they also captured the human cost of bureaucratic arrogance. Families wading through waist-deep water, carrying whatever possessions they could salvage. Children crying as they watched their toys and bicycles disappear beneath the flood. The water reached its peak around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. From my elevated position, I could see the entire subdivision submerged under several feet of muddy water. Rooftops and the upper portions of trees were the only things visible above the surface. It looked like a lake where a neighborhood used to be. My own property remained completely dry. The 40 acres where I had built my home and workshop sat on higher ground that had never been at risk of flooding. The contrast was stark and undeniable. The flood was affecting only the low-lying areas where the subdivision had been built, exactly where my dam would have prevented the water from reaching. As evening approached, I received a phone call that surprised me. It was Jennifer Morrison, calling from a Red Cross evacuation shelter. Her voice was different now, stripped of the arrogance and certainty that had characterized our previous interactions. "I need to ask you something," she said quietly. "Would your dam have prevented this flooding?" I paused before answering, choosing my words carefully. "Yes, Jennifer. My dam was specifically designed to capture and control the seasonal runoff that flows through this area. It would have prevented every drop of water that flooded your neighborhood today." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I made a terrible mistake, didn't I?" "Yes," I replied simply, "you did." The rain continued through the night and into the next day. By the time it finally stopped on May 20th, over 9 inches of precipitation had fallen in 48 hours. The National Weather Service confirmed that it was the largest single rainfall event in the area's recorded history. As the water began to recede, the true scope of the disaster became apparent. Every home in Meadowbrook Estates had suffered significant flood damage. Basements were filled with mud and debris. First floors were waterlogged and would require complete reconstruction. Cars, furniture, and personal belongings were total losses. The financial impact was staggering. Insurance adjusters estimated that the flood damage exceeded $12 million, but the human cost was even higher. Families who had invested their life savings in their dream homes were now facing bankruptcy. Children who had grown up in the neighborhood were traumatized by watching their entire world disappear under muddy water. And it all could have been prevented if Jennifer Morrison had not forced me to destroy my dam. I stood on my porch that evening, looking out over the devastated subdivision, and felt a complex mixture of emotions. I was vindicated, certainly. My warnings had been proven correct in the most dramatic way possible, but I took no pleasure in the suffering of innocent people who had simply trusted the wrong leader. The flood had delivered nature's verdict on the HOA's decision to prioritize aesthetics over safety. Jennifer Morrison's war against my dam had ended with the complete destruction of the community she had claimed to protect. It was a harsh lesson about the consequences of ignoring expert advice and the importance of understanding natural systems before making decisions that affect public safety. As I prepared for bed that night, I knew that the real battle was just beginning. The flood had ended, but the legal reckoning was about to start. Jennifer Morrison and her HOA board were going to face serious consequences for their negligent decision-making. and I was going to make sure that justice was served for every family whose life had been destroyed by their arrogance. The morning after the flood revealed a landscape that looked like a war zone. Where Meadowbrook Estates had once showcased perfect suburban living, there was now a wasteland of mud, debris, and destroyed dreams. I walked through the subdivision with my camera, documenting the devastation that could have been prevented with a simple earthen dam. The contrast between my undamaged property and the destroyed neighborhood was impossible to ignore. My home, workshop, and gardens were completely untouched by the flood. The 40 acres that Jennifer Morrison had wanted to control remained dry and pristine, while every square foot of the subdivision showed evidence of catastrophic water damage. Insurance adjusters arrived within hours of the flood's recession, armed with clipboards and measuring tapes. What they discovered would change everything for the HOA and its board members. The flood damage was so extensive and so clearly preventable that insurance companies began questioning whether they should pay claims at all. I received a call from one of the adjusters on May 22nd. "We understand you had a flood control structure that was removed prior to this incident," he said. "Can you provide documentation of that removal and the reasons behind it?" I had been waiting for this question. I retrieved my carefully organized files and provided copies of every document related to the dam removal. County orders, HOA correspondence, photographs of the demolition, and weather records that showed the clear connection between the dam's absence and the flooding. "This is extraordinary," the adjuster said after reviewing the evidence. "The flood damage appears to be directly caused by the removal of functional flood control infrastructure. This could affect coverage determinations for the entire subdivision." Word spread quickly through the displaced community. Residents who had been living in hotels and temporary shelters learned that their insurance companies were investigating whether the flood damage qualified as a covered loss. The key question was whether the flooding constituted an act of God or a preventable disaster caused by human negligence. Jennifer Morrison tried to maintain her authority even from the evacuation shelter. She sent emails to all residents, insisting that the insurance investigation was routine and that coverage would not be affected. She continued to blame the city's drainage systems and claimed that my dam would not have prevented the flooding. But her explanations were becoming harder to believe as expert opinions began to emerge. The county engineer who had originally approved my dam permits reviewed the flood damage and issued a preliminary report. His conclusions were devastating for the HOA's position. The removed flood control structure would have easily contained the rainfall event of May 1820, he wrote. The dam was specifically designed to prevent flooding in the low-lying areas that experienced the most severe damage. Its removal was the direct cause of the catastrophic flooding that occurred. Armed with expert confirmation of what I had been saying all along, residents began organizing legal action against the HOA. The first lawsuit was filed on June 2nd by Mrs. Chen, whose basement had been destroyed in the initial April flooding. Within weeks, 17 more families had joined the class action suit. The legal theories were straightforward but powerful. The HOA board had exceeded their authority by forcing the removal of flood control infrastructure on private property. They had ignored expert warnings about flood risks. They had prioritized aesthetic concerns over public safety. And they had caused millions of dollars in preventable damage through their negligent decision-making. Jennifer Morrison hired expensive lawyers to defend the HOA's actions, but their legal position was essentially hopeless. The evidence was overwhelming, and the damages were clearly documented. Insurance companies, faced with massive claims that resulted from preventable negligence, began their own legal action to recover their losses. The breakthrough came when the county attorney's office announced that they were investigating potential criminal charges related to the dam removal. The investigation focused on whether HOA board members had knowingly made false statements to government officials in order to force the removal of necessary flood control infrastructure. Public safety is not negotiable, the county attorney declared at a press conference. If individuals use their positions of authority to eliminate flood protections and put lives at risk, they will face the full consequences of their actions. The criminal investigation changed everything. Board members who had supported Jennifer Morrison's anti-dam campaign suddenly began distancing themselves from her decisions. Some of them hired their own lawyers and began cooperating with prosecutors in exchange for reduced charges. The civil lawsuits proceeded rapidly through the court system. Jennifer Morrison's lawyers tried various defenses, arguing that the dam was not necessary, that the flooding was unprecedented, and that the HOA had acted in good faith based on expert advice. But every defense crumbled under the weight of evidence I had carefully collected. The engineering reports were particularly damaging. Multiple experts confirmed that my dam had been properly designed and constructed. They calculated that it would have easily handled the May storm without any risk of failure. They also determined that the subdivision's drainage systems were completely inadequate for the area's natural flood patterns. As summer progressed, the legal and financial pressure on Jennifer Morrison intensified. The HOA's insurance policy did not cover damages caused by the negligent actions of board members. The organization faced potential bankruptcy as legal judgments mounted and insurance companies refused to pay flood damage claims. Some residents approached me privately to apologize for supporting the dam removal. They had trusted Jennifer Morrison's leadership and paid a terrible price for that misplaced trust. I felt sympathy for these families, but I also knew that their apologies could not undo the damage that had been done. The most satisfying moment came when Jennifer Morrison was forced to resign as HOA president. The board voted unanimously to remove her from office and issued a public statement acknowledging that the dam removal had been a catastrophic mistake. They also announced that the HOA would be dissolved and replaced with a new organization focused on practical community needs rather than aesthetic control. By the end of summer, the legal victory was complete. The courts had ruled decisively in favor of the flood victims, and substantial judgments were awarded against Jennifer Morrison and the other board members who had voted for the dam removal. The criminal charges were still pending, but the civil case had established clear responsibility for the disaster. The final legal judgment was delivered on September 15th, exactly 4 months after the flood that changed everything. Judge Patricia Williams read the verdict in a courtroom packed with flood victims, their families, and media representatives who had been following the case throughout the summer. The evidence clearly establishes that the defendants acted with gross negligence in forcing the removal of functional flood control infrastructure, Judge Williams declared. Their actions directly caused millions of dollars in preventable damage and put numerous lives at risk. This court awards full compensatory damages to the plaintiffs and finds the defendants jointly and severally liable for all flood-related losses. The monetary judgment exceeded $14 million, the largest civil award in the county's history. Jennifer Morrison and the other board members were ordered to pay damages to every affected family, plus legal fees and punitive damages designed to deter similar negligence in the future. But the financial judgment was only part of the justice that was served. The criminal charges resulted in felony convictions for Jennifer Morrison and two other board members. They were sentenced to prison terms and ordered to perform community service related to flood prevention and emergency management. The insurance companies also achieved their goals through the legal process. They successfully recovered their claims payments by proving that the flood damage was caused by preventable negligence rather than natural disaster. The precedent established by the case would protect other insurance companies from similar situations in the future. For the residents of what had been Meadowbrook Estates, the legal victory provided the financial resources needed to rebuild their lives. The damage awards allowed families to reconstruct their homes with proper flood protection measures and replace belongings that had been destroyed in the flood. More importantly, the community learned valuable lessons about the importance of flood control and the dangers of aesthetic-focused decision-making. The new neighborhood association that replaced the HOA made flood prevention their top priority and actively sought expert advice on all matters related to public safety. I was asked to serve as a consultant on the rebuilding project, helping to design improved flood control measures for the reconstructed subdivision. The new dam system that was built exceeded the capacity of my original structure, ensuring that future floods would be prevented even under extreme weather conditions. The rebuilt community was stronger and safer than the original development. Property values recovered quickly as buyers recognized the superior flood protection measures that had been implemented. The homes were built to higher standards, with elevated foundations and improved drainage systems that complemented the new flood control infrastructure. Jennifer Morrison served 18 months in prison and was required to attend classes on environmental protection and community leadership. Upon her release, she moved to another state and was prohibited from serving in any HOA leadership position as part of her probation agreement. The case became a landmark precedent for property rights and flood control law. Legal scholars studied the decision as an example of how aesthetic preferences should never override public safety considerations. The ruling was cited in similar cases across the country, protecting other property owners from HOA overreach. For me, the victory was both personal and professional. My warnings had been vindicated in the most dramatic way possible, and justice had been served for the families who suffered because of Jennifer Morrison's arrogance.